Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the 20th session of Living the Core. As I always say, this series of interviews is to truly connect to people who are living their core values in their life's works. A core is just like that amber, and when that amber converts itself or finds itself as a flame, that's when the amber gets fulfilled. Today in the live, we have an awesome guest who's not just converted his amber into that life flame, but he's also magnified it to be an Olympic flame. Now, why do I call it as this Olympic flame? The reason being, if you look at the history of the Olympic flame, it moved out to be the bridge between the ancient Olympics and the modern Olympics. That's exactly why I'm comparing Steve to that flame. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leela. It's a delight to be on your show.
Absolutely. Now, a little about who Steve is. Steve has about 3 decades of experience in the global and Indian HR space. He has been a leader in the HR space and he has worked with several Indian as well as multinational companies. He has worked with Diageo, he has worked with Reliance Jio, he has worked with Patti Computers, he has worked with Vodafone, he's worked with Hindustan Unilever, and many more. I mean, and one more. Steve, which one did I miss?
Xerox, I think.
Xerox. Superb. He is an alumnus of XLRI himself. Now, whatever I spoke about Steve, that's the 3 decades of HR experience is his first innings. Yeah, it's the corporate experience of Steve. What Steve we have right here in front of us is the second innings of Steve, where he is the executive coach, he is an author. I wouldn't just put it as an author, I would put it as an author who has a lot of research as a backing, who has dived deep into various facets. And today we are exactly talking about his new book, which just got launched yesterday, The Indian Boss at Work, wherein he brings in so beautifully what it is to be an Indian at the workplace, the fabric of Indianness. And that's where, Steve, I pull you on into my very first question to you. You know, when you read the book entirely, okay, there is this invisible Indianness that's in us, and you try to connect to that. You know, you put in light on that. Can you share with our viewers what is Indianness and who are we as Indians at our workplaces?
Fabulous. Thanks for that question, Leela. When you look at the whole subject of Indianness, there can be an ethnocentric lens, that is, somebody from outside looking at India, and there could be an emic lens, someone from within India looking at our own sense of what is Indianness. And in my book, I talk about both the ethic and the emic lenses and the differences in terms of perception. And it's bound to be in that sense. Uh, but to your question, what is Indianness? The reality is that unlike many cultures, our diversity, multiplicity, plurality is actually the unity, if you like, of uh, who we are as Indians. So therefore, it's for someone who's trying to look for a line of best fit to aggregate and say this is it, would be completely fooled, and it would be presumptuous to do that. Because for every sentence that you say about India, it's a rich country, it's also very poor. It's a very intelligent country, it's also a lot of ignorance. There are people who work in large communities and celebrate. There are also people who are very aesthetic and recluse. So it's very hard to describe India because the opposite also is true. Yeah. Now, when all of us identify ourselves with Indianness, there are certain common platforms like family values, our spirituality, our sense of respect, humility, the way we look at things. Yes, there is a common pot of several things. And, in the webinars I've been doing, you do find a cluster of attributes. But I want to bring the focus back to each one of the listeners today, Leela, on your program, which is there might be many lights that shine on us as to who we are. We might get defined as being a Ladakhi, or from Kanyakumari, or a Bengali, or from Kerala. We might be defined as something which is our religion, or our ethnic card, or our class, or the kind of community we are. My only suggestion is that all of this are only aspects of who we are, but they don't define us. Who we are and what we are is the Indianness that we define for ourselves. We have, as each individual, a right to define what does Indianness mean for each one of us, rather than being defined by some other on our behalf. So that's what I mean by saying, when I ask you, Leela, what is your Indianness? And you could say, this is it. And that's right. And, Sheila, what is your Indianness? And she says certain things. So it is not because of certain attributes, but it's all about self-definition and self-affirmation of what you consider to be your Indianness. Thank you, Leela, for that question.
Beautiful. Beautiful, Steve. And connecting to this, you use a beautiful analogy in your book, the seed versus the soil. The seed is given a lot of importance and the soil is neglected. Now, in what context did you pick this up, Steve?
The seed is what is popularly known as some universal core leadership theories of the day. And I have no problem with some of the theories of the day. But I just want to remind the listeners that these universal theories have come from the Second World War, have come from North America and from Europe, have come from mostly male, have come mostly from those in academia, and based on weird participants. Weird being mnemonic for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. The reality is that today's workplace has got a very masculine orientation. The fact is that the rest of the world is not weird. And therefore, when we look at this so-called core philosophy, and we believe that it can be thrown in multiple soils and it will flourish, the reality is, Leela, that it's not going to get nurtured in those soils. So the fact is that for India, let's say a soil condition, there is 7,000 years of a living civilization. Forget Mesopotamia, Inca, Greek, Byzantine, Roman era. It's a living oldest civilization. And as a consequence, India has got a Kal, which is, the ideas that have come over time. What Eric Fromm would call social character, or Yuval would call as the dominant ideas. And we have many dominant ideas. For instance, respect for elders, taking care of, people, Bishubla, keeping your door, your dirty shoes outside the door. So there is a Kal, and then there's a Desha, which is the region. And you understand that there are many Indias within India itself. And the ethnic card of India cannot be explained by some paired words that perhaps a Hosted or a Trompener or a Globe Study puts in. Because, in fact, as marketeers, we all know that there are many Indians and many things sell in some parts and some don't sell in the other parts. And finally, there is a Patra, which is actually coming from the three gunas of, the three qualities. But if you want an English translation, call it competencies or call it traits or call it temperaments. And therefore, what I'm only articulating is that if you throw your seeds, some may fall on rocks, some may fall on soil. It's important to study the context. And to understand the context, you have to bring in the context in order for the seeds to flourish. See, the fact is, Leela, that you and I, we all work in an English, in a Western foreground, but with an Indian background. I
True.
mean, the the example I could give you is like, imagine you're an NCPA theater watching a Shakespearean play. The audience are Indian, the actors are Indian, the stage is Indian, but we are talking about Shakespeare and to be or not to be in that sense, yeah. And can you imagine that we've got really two processes that operate, and we are constantly reconciling the two processes. So I argue that it's great to have seeds, but the seeds must have the right soil, and some seeds don't really work in the Indian context. For example, the Oedipus complex is actually doesn't really fully play itself out in India. In fact, the maternal enthrallment of mother, daughter-in-law, and son is a more interesting triangle. The karta and the kind of cathexis that the son has with the karta are far more significant and needs to be understood in terms of the role that he plays. So I'm really saying that bring the seed in, and the seed is good for comparative analysis, but never ever forget the
The
kind of
soil.
soil. And the problem with most seeds are with a Western kind of an orientation is that there's a belief that it will work anywhere. And this whole culture is sanitized, cleansed, and almost dismissed with. And if some culture is very small and very different and a maverick, it is then relegated to anthropology or sociology. And I'm saying it's not true. The soil is, in fact, the context on which action takes place, the context for thinking, feeling, and acting.
Beautiful. So, Steve, when you're saying this applies to India, this applies to every other culture in the world, right? So, when we are really expanding ourselves and as global, marketplaces, so when we get into any, you know, uh, place or any country, there is a certain culture of that country. And is that what you're actually referring to? You really need to honor the soil of that country.
Absolutely. And what I'm saying is, I use the word distinctive because in my book, I bring out 9 or 10 characteristic which seems to be a leaning, like high
Mhm.
power distance, a restrained society, a mixture of male and feminine, and so on, long term and short term orientation, etc. So there is some kind of a kind of a cohort, a cluster that is very distinctive, but it's not unique. They may also exist in the oriental part of the world. They may also exist in other parts. So I'm not
True.
saying it's a unique property of what I'm arguing is, and hear me carefully, every, as human beings, the imperatives, the challenges uh, are universal across human beings. But the way a society responds to those imperatives and challenges and dilemmas is cultural.
Very true.
So if I now take a step back and I look at the literature, then in many ways we are talking about an indigenous psychology of the West. Okay? And in fact, let me go one step further by saying all of leadership is actually to be understood as indigenous psychology. And we have to study indigenous psychology to really understand the kind of cultural context that sets up the basis for action.
Beautiful. Steve, this book is such a great resource for especially global managers who are working in India, and for our own Indian employees, to connect with who they are, and when they present themselves in workplaces, how they can connect themselves to their Indianness and bring that out. It's like, wear it really proudly and be happy with it. So superb, Steve. But in the book, somewhere you bring in the Trishanku part of it, okay? The leader's dilemma. What do you have to say about that?
Fa- That's a fabulous question, and it. I want to slightly rearrange when you talked about global counterparts looking at India, and therefore, at first glance, it may seem as if this book is meant for some global leaders who have got subsidiary operations in India, and therefore you can understand the Indians leaders even better. So, of course, that's true. Of course, that's true. It's to understand the cultural differences and be able to work with those cultural differences. But Leela, my book is not about the intercultural issues alone. My book is talking about that you, Leela, inside you, you have a Western orientation, and you have inside you an Indian orientation. Western because of postmodern world, English educated, and if I may say, aping of the West because they are affluent, rich, and we feel that had we been very rich like we were before 1700 AD, and we have always, between China and us, been 55% of the GDP of the world, we wouldn't have been aping the West. But in the current situation with colonial and so on, we tend. So there is a Western orientation. The workplace is Western with all of the, British management, then the Japanese management, then the American management. And we've never had a chance to talk about Indian management.
Indian
We've
management.
just been assaulted with so many types of, but now of late, with some Indians being successful both India and abroad, we talk of Indian management. So to come back to your point, one is that there is an intercultural orientation that we need to understand. But inside you, within India, there is this whole story of, let's say, Sikha versus Narayan Murthy. That's also a cultural cl- clash because of the orientations
Exactly.
of Western and Eastern. So inside each person, there is a leaning towards one or the other. And there could be clashes with, let's say, Cyrus with Ratan Tata, and there's many such examples I give in my book. So within India itself, there is this Western versus Indian idea and orientation and so on. But within you, and that's where the book is pitching at, within you, there are contradictions, dilemmas, polarities, paradoxes that need to be resolved. And what are these paradoxes? Do I put my boot on your neck and make you work? Or am I going to get work out of you through diplomacy? Do I fire you because it's now COVID times and my P&L cannot allow it? Or do I value loyalty, relationship, that you work for my grandfather and my father, and it doesn't matter? These kinds of Indianness seems to be at odds or at variance with the Westernness, between what somebody may say is very logical and this is etc. etc. So we call it in Sanskrit or in Hindi, we call it dharam sankatas. It is a clash. It is a clash of two cultures. It's a clash of a 7,000 year either conscious or unconscious, and a clash of postmodern education. Now, when I talk about this word Trishanku, who's Trishanku? He's a handsome king who wanted to go to heaven, and then halfway through he got stuck neither in heaven nor on earth. When I talk about Trishanku, I'm really referring to the fact that the Western and the Indian has not been co-held, integrated, individuated. If you want to use words like Carl Jung, but there needs to be a samtulan between the two sides. And when the integration doesn't take place, there is this Trishanku phenomena. When the integration is taking place, then you become an effective leader. So there are fabulous effective leaders outside, There are fabulous leaders inside. There are examples with strong focus on Indianness and with Western. Take Mukesh Ambani, for example. He strides both perfectly well. And take the same with other leaders. They have brought in their very strong Indianness to the workplace, even abroad, in that particular sense. The reality is that not all, in fact, most Indian leaders are not able to move in the maturity stage from what got them there to what will take them to the next phase. And there is distinctive leanings from one to the other. There might be organizations that are, and organizations are of different kinds. There are some professional companies, there are professional promoter led or professional multinationals, but there are also other organizations in India. The NGOs, the government, the bureaucracy, the owner of a kirana store, etc., etc. They're all leaders. And when you look at the large leadership that's there in the country, um, no guesses that and I know where the leaning is, and that leaning without the integration. So what I'm really saying, Leela, is I'm neither wishing to condemn the Western orientation or to glorify the Indian orientation. I'm simply saying the Harvard must meet the Rishi and become the Rajeshri, and
Wow.
therefore balance both the Western orientation, which has lots of benefits to offer us, at the same time, some of the values of Indianness, such as humility, respect, sensitivity, empathy, a sense of frugality, and a sense of living in a simple way. These are going to be the leadership values and the leadership dominant characteristics that we need today, more so now when you look at where we are in these COVID times. We need a leadership that's ecological, that is balanced. And when I look at all the kind of wisdom in India about, Shubh Labh, about the world is one family, when I look at about Sangatan Sukta, I look at Ahimsa, when I look at Dharma, my God, it's ancient wisdom that needs to be owned up. And that's what I mean by, the reference to, the integration.
Beautiful. Steve, again in this book, what you very nicely mentioned right now, in other words, you put it, it's the awareness that takes time.
Yes.
And you say that change is really sudden once the awareness sets in. So, in your experience, of course, you come from over 3 decades of the corporate experience, right? In the, being in the senior HR spaces. Um, if you look at it right now as an executive coach, when you're actually looking at leaders, where is this awareness standing?
So first, let me confirm my position of why I think awareness takes time and change is rapid. Because that seems to be counterintuitive to what most people think, that change takes time. If you realized, let's say my t-shirt, if I realize there's a bad smell around, and I finally figure out that the bad smell is because of my stinky t-shirt, if I know the root, I can just go and have a bath, remove my t-shirt, and I'm done with the change. If you knew that after years and years, finally the penny drops, you know what to do. The what to do, how to do is not the issue. The real issue is how come this is happening? How come? If you look at, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, there's so much of rational, logical discussion that Krishna is having with Arjun, because both are very educated, highly intellectual people. But in the end, when Krishna says to Arjun, abandon all material dharma and reside in me, reside in the spiritual dharma. It's at that particular point that the final penny dropped, and he became totally aware that what is he doing? Not doing his dharma of picking up the sword and going to war. You get what I mean? So,
Yeah.
if for some people it might take 99 steps before the fall, for some you can give them a push in the butt and they may just jump off the cliff. But whatever it takes, it's the fall that creates the sudden aha. That's why we keep saying no in modern literature, that aha moment, that penny dropping, the moment of epiphany.
Eureka.
Somebody says, I gave up smoking, but suddenly I was smoking, and this one thing happened. My son spoke to me or something, and then that moment I threw all my cigarettes. So awareness takes time. Change can be sudden. Uh, in the other question that you asked me was, what is the degree of awareness in organizations? See, awareness takes place, which I mentioned in my book too, when there is Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. In other words, to understand, to first listen, to understand, and then to deeply contemplate. Very similar to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the last three limbs of the eight, which is Dhyana, Dharana, and Samadhi. And what does it mean? It means that there has to be a deep inquiry of just not listening to the words, but being able to understand the import of those words. And then to, to examine those words in the context of one's own lived experience. Not to have beliefs or replace one belief system with another belief system. What is being what is required is an interrogation of the truth, the Vedant. And through this truth, as we say, na, the truth shall set you free. And therefore, I leave it to you to ask yourself, in a busy world that we go in, where we are fighting routines, we call ourselves the rat race and so on, the multiple processes of what we do. Is there enough of time that corporate executives have in this process of having an experience, reflecting on the experiences, concretizing what's happening, testing it out, and so on and so forth? Is there enough of time? So that's why corporates have these retreats and they have various things. But what I'm trying to do with my book is saying that you're a boat on the river, you do a lot of boat work, but would you also look at the river? You know, can you articulate the inarticulate? Can you look at what has been withheld? Can you see what is the invisible that needs to be made visible? And more importantly, is there the disowned that needs to be owned and legitimized? So,
Beautiful.
so it requires a kind of looking, yeah, and very often, Leela, the looking is not the looking of a scientific look, which is reductionist, positivist, which analyzes and reduces, has a control group, it segregates it, looks for causal relationship. The looking, that's very good for science. But the looking that's inside, as you know and I know, is experiential. It's pattern generation. It's wholesomeness. It's holistic. And it requires a commitment to go from the phenomenological level, if I may, to the interpersonal level, to the intrapersonal level, and even to the intra-existential level of the psyche. And that requires taking layers and layers to be able to penetrate. Unlike most subjects, if let's say you are studying physics, you read the first 7 chapters, the eighth chapter is like a breeze because it becomes easier based on the foundation you've had in the first 7 chapters. With human beings, you and I know that somebody who thinks human beings are either zeros or ones and simplify the equation, they know nothing. The more you read chapter 1 to 7, you read chapter 8, it becomes even more complex because you're going down and down and down. And it's fascinating in terms of, because there is, I mean, I could just continue talking about the whole thing, but the fact is that there is the Atmic self that we have, and there is the social self, yeah, which is the identity. And then there are psychological locations, and then there are role taking. And so we have to be constantly in touch with the kind of showing up in the way the Atmic self takes on to identity, and the way the locations offer evocations, resonances, not dissonances, to what's happening in terms of role taking, meaning making, choice making, action taking, etc., etc. Stop me if I'm sounding very obtuse.
Oh, Steve, there's actually so much of coming in, and I see aspects of karma yoga also coming in this whole thing, right? When you are actually, talking. So if I were to ask you, how can you apply uh, karma yoga in the modern context, in today's context, at workplaces? What would you say, Steve?
Nice. See, to be a yogi is to be a pursuit of the ultimate truth. And karma yogi is about, this whole thing about service. Let me tell you, work in the Indic tradition is seen as chitta shuddhi, which
The
is the
should.
whole thing about, and through sacrifice, through helping others, selfless service, etc., etc., one is able to meet the obligations and serve others. Now, there is a fabulous tradition. We keep the Western world. We see people saying in search for happiness, in search for happiness.
Mhm.
In India, this whole thing is about uh, the removal of the dukkha. Uh, and we look for the ultimate bliss, not happiness. Because if you buy one, you get the other one free, which is sadness. But we look for bliss. That because our belief is that within us there is the Satchit Ananda, that we are already blissful, and we have forgotten that within ourselves. Yeah, we have forgotten that within ourselves. So, if you look at then the Indian notion of what is it that we do, one of the strongest things that we do is to follow a kind of uh, a what is said as dharma, which is for those who are non-Indians. It's the India's word to the world, in the sense is that it explains the rules of conduct and how one must live in society, for which everybody is trying to making certain that everyone ends up with a good citizen. But the good thing, or the very interesting thing about dharma, is it's contextual. It's contextual. And what A.R. Ramanujam has identified as is there an Indian way of thinking? And the dharma is a very context specific response to an action. So, depending on what station of life you are, where you are in the class, we have Kula Dharma, we have so many forms of dharma, including how you will respond in an emergency, which is the Apa Dharma. Okay. So, while we go through the four ashramas, starting from students stage to householder and so on, within that, at one level, there's also another level, which is follow dharma, enjoy life through, the kama and artha. But the final destination is about, that moksha and that bliss. Am I making sense? So,
Beautifully, yes.
so, so at one level, you seem to have a dilemma, but which actually isn't a dilemma, which is that for every one of us, there is that swadharma, which is I come alone and I have to find through dharmic actions a way to get to a point, which we all know what the point is. But it is through service, it is through chitta shuddhi, it is through being a karma yogi. And of course, many people have misunderstood the term, which is the famous expression in the Bhagavad Gita, which is only keep in mind the effort, don't keep in mind the fruit, and the ethnocentric lens from someone from an ethnocentric lens, a Western orientation, would look at it and say, oh, these folks are basically someone who's given up on life or
Not result
uh,
oriented.
not result oriented, they're passive, and so on and so forth. Forgetting history. That for God's sake, yeah, for 1700 years, up until 1700 AD, only for the last 300 years, and that too because of the colonial, we have been, along with China, the richest nations, almost commanding 60% of the GDP of the world. We were called the Golden Chiria. And I want to say to all the listeners who are on this podcast today that we are not a developing country. We are a resurgent nation, taking pride back to be at that place that we once were. It is
Beautiful.
sad, Leela, it is sad that for many of us, we rather read Milton and Shakespeare than Valmiki and Kabir. Many Spanish and Italians, they know their culture inside out. Many of us know a little bit about our literature because of some TV show or some comic magazine or a grandmother who has told us this story. But it seems like something obscure and something in antiquity and something perhaps even spiritual.
Steve, yeah, I
Yeah,
just lost you a moment. So I was like, yeah, you were saying we lost you actually. You said it's sounding obscure and what?
sounding obscure and almost in antiquity,
Got it.
old and ancient. But the reality is, Leela, that all of this wisdom, all of this kind of the river. I mean, if you're on the river, let's say in Bengal, the river has come from Gangotri.
Exactly.
You can't deny the waters that have the tributaries that have joined. Okay, so whether you're conscious or unconscious, there is that whole Indian orientation is that brings you there. So for me, the book is about going upstream the river, going upstream, going all the way up to Rishikesh, climbing up towards the Gangotri, the source, and seeing the multiple tributaries of where India is, to understand the rich inheritance
The
and today
Ganges
our
body.
and today our modern legacy. And I
Beautiful.
want and I would love for people to be in touch with history because those who, as they say, who forget history, how will you create your geography?
Children would love you, Steve. Forget history, but if you know geography. Yeah, but that's a beautiful insight. Exactly. It's your history that gives you your geography.
You have to know your
Beautiful.
history in order to in order
Exactly.
to to
Beautiful.
break new grounds.
Steve, as put up, your core is curiosity, honesty, courage, hard work, spirituality, and gratitude. We see a lot of curiosity, in you going up the Ganges, into the streams and into Rishikesh and up to Gangotri. So that curiosity, I kind of sense it, right? Um, and you have brought in immense amount of courage as well in the book. If I were to reflect and ask you, how is courage? Because you're putting your what you feel is the truth. That's where the honesty part of it comes in. Yeah, so through your research you have kind of connected to the truth, and in your inner awareness you've connected to the truth, and you bring it out with courage. So if I were to ask you, how do you play courage in the book, what would you have to say?
See, if you got one aspect which is beliefs, and the other aspect is you have known truths or personal convictions or values, then courage comes from knowing the truths and having personal convictions, and lack of courage is about belief systems. See, when you believe that A, B, C. It's a belief. And every belief has a doubt. And the doubt can expand because it is a belief system. But when the belief is known and it's your truth, and you've tested it over the years, it becomes a
Mhm.
personal conviction. So when I was very young, perhaps I may have had lots of beliefs about how people are and what organizations are and what will work, dominated by theories of the day. Today I have convictions. And therefore, with my convictions, it's reasonably very easy to be courageous because you're not staking your life, you're staking meanings of life.
Beautiful.
You're staking meanings to life. And I think when you allow what the Jain philosophy calls as the Sayadvada, which is that there are multiple truths. It's like a good analogy would be spotting the way the six blind men spotted the elephant and described it differently.
Mm, mm,
So when you look at people and they're describing the elephant, are you open? Do you have the courage to say, okay, I see a rope, which is the elephant's tail, but is it possible the rope could be something else like a tree trunk or perhaps like a wall with the chest? Am I open to multiple meanings and bring in inclusion and plurality of views? That's not courage. That is merely the curiosity to be able to stake your meanings on the fire, on the anvil of the fire. And if those meanings get strengthened, then they become even more stronger and powerful. So continue to stake your beliefs till you are
yeah,
able to integrate your values. Courage comes from that. It's it's really about, and I think something, Leela. Every time you find somebody vulnerable and open with his emotions, by God, everyone around the room would be saying, "She is so courageous. I could not do that." To be able to. I mean, so one of the things I want to say to your listener is, be vulnerable, be open. People will see you as being courageous.
beautiful. Steve, just one question because you told me, and yesterday when the launch was happening, one of your ex colleagues also came in and said that there are two different aspects of Steve. The Steve who is a taskmaster, who is that, you're the go getter, in your words, the westernized, influenced Steve. Yeah, and now you have the Steve of you being a researcher, you being a seeker of truth, and you kind of standing in for that awareness, inner awareness. So when did the shift actually happen, and how was it for you? So it's because I believe that this seeker was not missing then also, when you were in your corporate life, and now also there is that part of you, that in you as well. So but when did you really connect to it, and when did you actually consciously start working on who you are as an inner?
Thanks for that question, Leela. You know, a binary is a difficult word for me. I think as brands evolve, humans evolve, and they sometimes on a line they go from one point to a counterpoint, but they never transcend the point and go to another line. I see evolution as moving from one line to another line, not
Beautiful.
not about uh, the counterpoints, okay, or even the samtulan of the counterpoints of trying to
Super.
balance the 2 points. I'm talking about transcendence from one line to another line. When I look at transcendence, and it's true for all the listeners on this call, I remember the time when I was in my teens. I wanted to be, in with most teenagers. That's how I learned to smoke, actually, because I wanted to be part of the in group. Uh, in my 20s, I wanted to be a contributor, and individual strength and prowess and competency and demonstrate my competence. So then in the 20s. In my 30s, I wanted to influence and impact and have large places to work on and do things like that, and therefore CHRO and kind of stuff. In my 40s, I must admit, I wanted to have some wealth. My kids were going to college, and I wanted to have some. And I also saw, at some point of time, this is not going to last if I don't, also build some assets. And today, at 50, life's given me a lot, and I'm extremely grateful for at each stage I've had to play like a marathon. You have different strides for different rides, right? On the race, you don't do a 100-meter dash unless it's a 100-meter at the end of the marathon. So I think one thing. Sorry, something popped up on my screen.
Okay.
So you don't end up. In my 50s now, there is a deep desire to give back. Uh, you know, I
Beautiful.
I was reflecting, Leela, on my personal purpose. I wish I knew my personal purpose when I was younger. I wish most people, when they are younger, zoom into personal purpose earlier than I did. But my personal purpose now, at this stage in my life, is to follow my own light
Superb.
and to help others follow
See
theirs.
that light.
To follow theirs.
Beautiful.
And therefore, it becomes easier for me to play with my light and to be in my own Vedant and truth and to support somebody without saying you should be this or you should be that. There are people who know me and would have certainly said Steve was a hard nosed, strong personnel manager. And the fact is, yes, you're describing a Steve that was relevant for a particular phase. Like I've done maybe 16, 17 mergers and acquisitions in my life. I've had to do whitewater rafting, navigating 20 yards at a time without looking at postmortem and having the ability to reflect and to do this amount of self-reflexivity. I've had to handle seven bowlers bowling different kinds of balls and even curve balls at me at various stages. And therefore, like I said, you have to be a leader who's contextual to the situation.
Very.
And in every game, if it's a history paper, you don't want to write geography, right? It was a 20-day match, 20 over match. You don't have to play like Jeff Boycott and think it's a 5-day series or something. So you have to be relevant to context, and I have tried in whatever way I
Beautiful.
can to be. So you know how it is, Leela. There are you must be having over a dozen friends, and each of them would have a Leela who is one kind of a Leela. It's for me. There's an evolution, but there's also a perception of how people see, and their perception tells me a lot about who they are and what they and how they value, and what is the valuing process as they start to perceive you and describe and use adjectives of you. Does that
Beautiful.
make sense?
Said. Very well. And I really love the, different bands of evolution that you gave in. Uh, Honestly, that's a beautiful insight. Very often people stick to one band and
Mm,
the really, the binary, what you said, the
mm,
duality, that part of it. But
mm.
to transcend beyond bands and to really go higher is something that's what is really connecting with oneness also is right.
And I think, Leela, when you are in the same line and you are going from point to counterpoint, then you end up with taking stances of, either to defy or to deny, to renounce or to denounce, to abdicate or to, step forward. You're constantly in that modality. But what you need to do is the Indian wisdom of the middle path, which is to define, to announce, to define. And if that define is about re-looking and recalibrating, then you need to step into that redefining. and to take that position. Because all change comes not finally in terms of taking choices in situation. All change comes from the change that you make within.
Wow, beautiful, Steve. So one last question for you. Yeah. Uh, we have a very different workforce right now, and the challenges at workplace are very different than what you probably saw in in the different decades of work that you have had. If you were to actually connect to the current day workforce and share a message as to how they can be strong and um, kind of what you said, evolve in their workspaces, what was it that you would want to say?
Yeah. So again, Leela, to push back at you, there has never not been a VUCA world in any situation. I mean, if you talk to your grandparents, they would say that we've had a VUCA world, Second World War, First World War, whatever, and famines and so on. I mean, every time we sit together, we come up with this illusion that we are in a VUCA or some new world. The reality is there is always going to be a context, and there's always going to be enough of competence to manage the context. Okay, so
Beautiful.
I do not believe that we are in a challenging world. When you look at something, you can either see it as a challenge or you can see it as an opportunity. What you decide, I mean, you and I both know that this whole
Makes
COVID
huge.
world has offered so much of opportunities for us to be humans again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for the young people,
Absolutely.
uh, what is my message? Everyone keeps touting the word resilience and do this and being able to manage this and so on. My message to uh, all of the folks is you must have like everyone who has succeeded, whether it was my grandfather or way back in the in antiquity, they've all had learning agility. And what does that mean? To be able to the self with system. How does the self interface with system? And to realize that I am part of the system, and by God, the system also needs me, and the system also has to benefit me. The problem is we only think that we work for systems, but
True.
systems also must work for us, right? I mean,
For us.
we work for family, but the family must work for us. We work for organization also exists for us. We work for a club. The club also has to work for us. This mutuality of the self and the system needs to be understood and has to be recalibrated, re-socialized. So what am I saying really? I'm saying, look, crystal ball gazing of all the pundits I don't do. There are too many people who are calling out. I tell you, they're all going to be wrong because we have no idea of the kind of change that's going to take place.
Exactly.
We have no idea. So what do we have ideas about? If we have no idea
So we
what
are.
if you have no idea what's going to happen outside, what ideas do you have? The only idea you have is the idea of the self,
Exactly.
the institution that's within us, and to be able to work with the institution as it emerges. What is about living? Living is nothing but the intelligent use of the self in
Exactly.
managing the self and managing the other and managing the system.
Beautiful. And it's all really starts from managing the self, knowing the self, right?
Yeah, knowing the self is one aspect. Merely knowing yourself is not enough. Just having self insight is not enough. One must be aware also of how others see you because you exist in a system, like somebody like Hogan was saying. You know, whatever insight you may have is not going to get you anywhere. It's what reputation you have. So it's
Exactly.
your reputation that got you here. It's your reputation that will take you there. So to be able to be self-insightful at the same time to also manage reputation, it comes back to and there's this lady I forget her name now, Tasha Yurik, And
Mm-hmm.
she wrote a book called Insight, and she actually makes the phenomenal comment through research that there is no correlation between having self insight and having a strong reputation. They are not correlated. Yeah, and it's amazing in terms of what that means.
And if you were to bring in the earlier context that you said, it's not only important to know the seed, but it's really important to know the soil as well.
Bang
So,
on, Lila. Bang on. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. Both are important, and it's like the numerator and the denominator. You have to work with the numerator. You've got to work with the denominator. You cannot leave one for the other. And those
super.
who forget one or the other and do not see the interface of the self with system pay the price. Pay the price and the consequences.
Beautiful, Steve. Thank you so much. And I mean, I had so many more questions for you, but I'm not taking them on because it's already been an hour. My last bit, okay, which I really love when you say that. When you have to say that adhikar and anurag, I'm really in love with that. So, if you were to give the current day managers this beauty that you bring in about adhikar and anurag, what would you want to say?
Be a gardener for self
Wow.
and for others. Water the plant, give it sunshine, talk to it, give it care, but also prune and also remove the weeds. By doing Adhikar and Anurag, you are the gardener and you're gardening self and you're gardening the other. And that's what our roles are. We exist for self and we
And for
exist for
others.
others.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Steve. It is, as always, great talking to you. Viewers, first I met Steve was in an NHRD conference, and I was blown by who he is. And you must have seen it. And his book is truly amazing. As he was saying, it's really for us to know the soil and to connect with who we are as Indians and embrace it and kind of wear it on and be this global Indian leader. What would you have to say, Steve?
No, absolutely. Is to be able to making certain that you understand your Indianness, legitimize it, grace it, own it, and all of it starts with understanding what Indianness is, isn't it? So this
Exactly.
book offers you a voyage of discovery. Would you enter?
Beautiful. Beautiful. So go ahead, enjoy reading it. And thank you, Steve, for bringing in this awesome book. I wish you all the very best and wish the Indian Boss at Work becomes a transformative book for people who are really looking at, you know, uh, s- changing the landscape of who we are in the global, space on being Indian. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Leela. Thank you very much for your best wishes, and thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure uh, to interact with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. I'll catch you again very soon. Viewers, please do like and share this video and please do comment and share what is it that you really connected to in this conversation with Steve. And we look forward to hearing back from you. And next week, we are again back and see you again. Take care. Bye bye. Good night.
Bye bye. Bye, everyone.